I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 3 of the 2022 Spring Miniskein mini-series. I love color mixing, whether I am doing triangles or grids, and the colorways I created as part of the 2021 Hanukkah special really made me want to create a rainbow set with some of these muted colors I created by mixing bright colors with black. In each of the various sets I created, there was a pale muted color I was pretty obsessed with for all of them, using just a tiny hint of the rainbow color, a 0.06% depth of shade, with either a 0.25 or 0.125% depth of shade of black. However, when I checked all of the various little grids, this color didn't really read very yellow or orange. So I decided instead to focus on some of the colors that had a 2-to-1 ratio of black to the rainbow colors. I spent a lot of time staring at the flat lay where I had all of those colors out together, looking at individual rows to try to make sure the recipes I was going to use would work out pretty well. In last year's Summer Miniskein mini-series, I created a fade set, layering colors, using different premixed colors and navy. But one of them didn't feel quite right because the proportions of the navy to that green just weren't what I wanted. And so I spent some time adjusting and playing around with the colors until I got something I liked a lot more. But this time, since I've already done these grids and I have the recipes for those colors, I am more confident in my ability to create a muted, dark, rainbow set of 20-gram Miniskeins. The 7 colors we will be using today are Cherry Bomb, Blazing Orange, Brilliant Yellow, Emerald Green, Extreme Blue, Royal Purple, and True Black. Of these 7 colors, only Brilliant Yellow and True Black are listed as primaries on Dharma's website. The rest of the colors probably have some mixture of pigments. But these are the ones that I collected that data on because while it may make sense to just have primaries in your collection versus other pre-mixed colors, there's no reason why you have to use primaries for color mixing. You can use whichever dyes you have in your collection. And I picked each of these because they're really, really pigmented versions of their respective color. I could play around with the mixing of our yellow, blue, and red to create the secondary colors that we need to mix with black to create this rainbow. However, since I happen to have the data with these pre-mixed secondary colors, that's what we will be using here today. And to dye our first layer, we are going to measure out some True Black acid dye. When I did the color mixing previously, I added the dyes together before adding the yarn and stirred things up. This time, since we're layering the colors on top of one another, we may see a lot more variation in the hues that we see, because if part of the yarn had more black than another part, and then maybe part of the yarn has more purple than another part, we'll see some different shades of color within the yarn, which is part of the fun of the colorway. All of the yarn we're dyeing today are 20-gram Miniskeins from Wool to Dye For. We have Platinum DK, the Superwash MCN High Twist, Diamond Sock, Shiela Sparkle, which is the Silver Stellina version, Crazy 8, Titanium Sock, and finally That Yak. We will be dyeing these all together. There may be a couple different batches, but I'm not doing each base separately. So if one of these bases absorbs color a little faster than another, one may end up being a bit more pigmented than another. But I'm excited to see if we notice any observable differences between these bases. Now, one other thing I am going to do is I'm going to leave one set of titanium and one set of That Yak out of the black dye and put them back in when we're about to dye up the different colors. And the reason why I want to do that is, well, to see what the colors look like without the black mixed in when we're dealing with a base that's already gray versus not. We are going to dye the black in 2 5-gallon buckets. Each bucket has 9 120-gram sets. So there will be 1,080 grams of yarn in each bucket, and that is the number that I'll use to calculate as I measure out dye which we'll do shortly. But first, I am going to add enough water into the bucket to completely cover the yarn to allow this to pre-soak for a couple of hours. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start measuring out the True Black acid dye for the first layer of color that we're gonna add onto the yarn. I made a game time decision that I wanted to go with the 0.5% depth of shade of black and then a 0.25% depth of shade of the rainbow color later on. Each bucket has 1,080 grams of yarn, and I would need 5.4 grams of the True Black acid dye to get that 0.5% depth of shade, because a 1% depth of shade would be 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. I measured out the 5.4 grams of dye I needed twice, using one container for each bucket. I dissolved the dye in hot tap water, bringing the volume between 500 and 700 milliliters total. The actual volume is not that important. What's more important is the total amount of dye that we're adding in. Normally, if I'm dyeing in a 5-gallon bucket, I would do this outside, but it is the middle of winter. So I am gonna wanna remove the yarn from the pre-soak. Now, it doesn't matter, and I'm setting the yarn in just my steam pan off camera. It doesn't matter if the amount of dye in each batch is exact, because all 6 skeins for each of our rainbow sets are in the same bucket. And so therefore, they will all have access to the same amount of dye. And so that is more important than what's happening bucket to bucket. And so little by little, I am removing this. I have to remember, I have dyed more yarn than this in a bucket at once. So when I'm feeling a little nervous, I shouldn't be. Or at least that's what I'm telling myself. I'm standing up on a step stool. Now I am gonna go ahead and add all of the black dye from one batch to our dye bath. And I'm using the bath to rinse out the cup. And I'm gonna stir this up really, really well with my tongs. And so far, nothing has been splashed, and so that is very, very good. Okay, now I'm collecting all of the yarn, and I'm gonna add it all into the bucket at the same time. There's, again, no acid in here yet. This should allow us to get not perfectly even necessarily, because the pot will be relatively crowded, but more even coverage than otherwise maybe we would get. And I'm trying very, very hard to not splash. Oh man, it's heavy. All right. That is pretty good. I guess I suppose I should check. Yeah, if I pull these apart, I'm seeing reasonable coverage everywhere. And again, if we don't end up with perfect coverage, that is all right. Now we need some acid, and I'm gonna add 1 cup of white vinegar here into our bucket. Just pour it on top of the yarn, because that's what we're doing. And then we're gently rinsing and lowering this. I'm gonna try to like move these minis apart, sort of around a little bit. Hopefully no zip ties break on me. That's probably good enough. I think even we can do some pushing like this to mix it up. But now we're gonna let things sit for a couple of days, hoping that we can get most of this color to absorb using this cool vat. So then we can come back and separate everything to layer on the other color. And it's looking so dark right now. I'm like, oh no, I hope I don't regret anything. But it's okay to have doubts. That's part of the process too. So it's almost 1 p.m. on a Friday, and I think I'm gonna let this sit at room temperature until Monday morning. Putting a lid on, and I will carefully carry this where it can safely sit out of the way for a couple of days. Then I repeated the entire process with our second bucket. Removing the yarn from the pre-soak, letting as much of the water remain in the bucket as possible, adding our 5.4 grams of dye that I had dissolved in water, putting the yarn back in, sort of stirring things up, making sure dye is distributed, and then adding 1 cup of white vinegar on top of everything, stirring it up, and setting everything aside for a couple of days. It's Monday morning, and I am going to take the yarn out of here and place it into a pasta insert so that way we can steam set the black. The only reason why I am bothering to do this, and ooh, I see some tonal variation. The only reason why I am doing this is that when we add 1 skein of that yak and titanium that does not have any black dye on it, I don't want there to be color transfer if we can help it. So I figured that steaming at this stage may make sense. Now, I could have just kettle dyed this yarn versus doing this cool vat over a few days. However, I have limited pot space, and so therefore I would have had to do a lot more batches than I am actually doing now because, yeah, it's just easier to do big batches like this. But we'll check to see what our final watercolor is like in a moment. But yeah, with the equivalent of almost 11 skeins of yarn, you can see how crowded the pasta insert is. This is fine for steaming, but I would have had a ton of variation if I tried to do anything else in there. And I think, yeah, there's still some more. Still some more. All right. Okay, and I'm going to take this just over to the stove and steam it for, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes. It doesn't need to be that long, but I just want to avoid transfer. I mean, another test we could do is just checking. I mean, I'm not seeing anything on a paper towel, but this doesn't hurt anything. And don't worry, I did put plenty of water at the bottom of that steamer basket. Now let's take a look at the watercolor. And there is a hint of some color left in here, but pretty much all of this is clear. Almost all of the color is in our yarn, which is great. Now, I think I may go ahead and use some of this water for the kettle dyeing because we have plenty of acid in here. Yeah, I think I might do that, to just reuse that water. I could reuse this water for this particular project, but I think I might actually reuse it for a leave no dye behind that I may do at the end of dyeing the next rounds of batches of these colors. Now I am going to do the same thing with our second bucket. I just turned off the heat, but I'm gonna let things sit for a little bit just because I am running to the mailbox to drop off one of your packages. Once the yarn had cooled, I needed to divide the yarn into 6 sets for the 6 colors we will be over dyeing this charcoal gray. Each of the pots had 2 different bundles of different bases, so I should have 4 bundles in each of these 6 pans I'm dividing the yarn into. I am gonna go put 5 of these bundles off to the side, and let's take a closer look at one of them because I definitely see a little bit of variation from the yarn that we have here. All right, we have the second bundle I removed the yarn from and the first bundles I removed the yarn from. The yak definitely looks darker than the other yarn, but it is close. Like, it's not as extreme as it was before. It looks like Crazy 8 did absorb more dye than I think we have some diamond that was in there. In addition, with one of our sparkle blends, these feel a little bit more muted, and the Crazy 8 felt darker across the board. Whereas everything in this bundle with the Superwash MCN and some titanium feels a little bit more even. But you can see we do have tonal variation. There might be some lighter patches in some of the skeins and some deeper patches. So as we layer the colors on top, we will likely have variation there as well. But we can't forget that we did want to add 2 skeins to each pot. And I will add these onto one of the zip ties that we have in the pans instead of adding, I think, a whole separate tie for each of them. But I'm going to add a skein of the Titanium Sock, our 75/25 Superwash Merino Nylon, and that Yak, which is 70%. I think it's 70% Superwash Merino, 20% Yak, 10% nylon, I believe. So we are going to dye these along with the gray minis for each of the rainbow colors, bringing the total amount of yarn in each of these samples to 400 grams. And this will be a fun comparison to see how the colors look on the Yak and Titanium compared to when we had overdyed both of those with the black already. I put my deluxe rubber respirator, safety glasses, and gloves on to measure out our 6 rainbow colors that we need for the next stage. As I mentioned, we are going to be dyeing 20-gram mini skeins for each of these colors, which is a total of 400 grams of yarn. Since we want the final depth of shade of these rainbow colors to be 0.25%, that means that we need 0.25 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn, or 1 gram of dye of each of these colors total. I measured out the dye with my scale and then dissolved the colors in hot tap water, not worrying about the volume very much because we're going to use all of this dye on each of these colors. Don't forget it is always worth double and triple checking your math before getting started. And because I don't want to risk anything tipping over, I am going to place these into a secondary container just to help avoid any spills. But now we can set up our first 2 dye baths. In this 12-quart stainless steel dye pot, I have 32 cups of water, and I am going to add 8 tablespoons of white vinegar. 5, 6, 7, 8. This gives us a ratio of 2 tablespoons of vinegar per 8 cups of water. And I'm going to remove some of the liquid so we have it to mix our colors as needed if we turns out we need more water to dissolve the dyes. And let's start with our yellow color. I'm going to take some of this up, but it actually looks like we were pretty well dissolved. So I'm going to take the reserve water I had, mainly because the pot's already going to be pretty full, and so I didn't want to have like a lot more liquid coming in if needed. But now I'm going to go start heating this up before we add our yarn. In my 4-inch deep full-size catering steam pan, I have added 32 cups of water and 8 tablespoons of white vinegar. And now I'm going to come in with our 1 gram of the blazing orange dye. I considered using my 8-quart dye pot to do like another round of tonals, but that would be pretty crowded with 400 grams. And so we're going to try doing this in the steam pan, which is not the way that I usually do tonals, but it should work reasonably well. I did pull some water out as well, just in case I needed to rinse out the cup more. It's going to be a bit crowded, but we'll give this a shot. And I'm going to start heating this up. We're over 2 gas burners on my stovetop, so we can dye a batch of yarn as well. We're boiling and it's steamy, so I'm reducing the heat to low, and hopefully this will defog in a moment. There we go. All right, and I'm going to come in with our 400 grams of yarn. I have tongs nearby should I need them, and we're going to start adding this to the pot. So I'm doing a quick dunk, but then I'm going to raise the yarn and sort of separate it. The goal isn't exactly to have a dip-dyed colorway, even though we are functionally doing that, but I want to try to get some coverage of this yellow color all over. And even with the heat setting of the black, it is possible, it's definitely possible that we will get some color transfer from the yarn to the rest, but maybe we won't. So now I'm gonna turn the heat back up a little bit, and we're gonna wait 30 minutes to see if all of the color absorbs. But what I like is that you can see on the titanium the color, like the approximate depth of the color that we have. And maybe I'll come every once in a while to give things a little bit of just a stir that won't hurt anything. But let's go and get our orange going. Okay, our orange is looking well dissolved, and we're gonna bring over our 400 grams of yarn. Okay. And adding it all the way in, lifting it up, trying to add in different parts. This is a little different than using a kettle just because of the way things, I guess, are positioned around here. I am attempting to move this around enough so that way we can get coverage everywhere, which maybe using the tongs versus sort of dipping up and down is a way to go here. Certainly there will be some resist in here just because of the pot being a little crowded, but that's the same for the kettle as well. But actually a lot of the color you can see is already in the yarn. There is some yellow pigment that is not yet, and I'm a hair nervous because I don't know if I see it in the yarn. I mean, certainly over here I see it, so like we know that that color is there, but I'm not observing it on the rest of the yarn, but it's hard to say. I mean, I see it here, so we will see. We will see how things go, and if we need to add more color to some of it, then that's what we will do. Oh dear. I mean, I see the color on like the plain titanium, and clearly like color has to go on these others as well. So I don't know. This is me second guessing myself, which, you know, I am known to do. It's possible I should have done things in smaller batches, but we are going for something that is overall very, very muted. So we're gonna carry on, and I will be back in 30 minutes. And again, I might come and stir every once in a while or so. And I think that what we're seeing on the titanium hopefully is an indication that we're getting some of this all over. Fingers crossed. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I am a classic overthinker when it comes to projects like this. I've talked about this before, but sometimes when I have a specific vision in mind of where I want to end up, I can get more nervous when I'm not sure if we're gonna get there or not, because there's a lot of factors coming into play here. I am layering the colors one at a time versus having them mixed in a pot. I am dyeing multiple different fiber contents all in one kettle, which means that some will pick up more color than others. I'm starting hot instead of cold, which means that I'm not gonna get as even coverage as I may have if I was doing cool vat for each of these stages. And so all of these things are swirling in my head. But if I need to, I can always add more dye. And the main difference between what I'm doing here right now and what I did in the 2021 Summer Miniskein mini-series, where I was overthinking a green a lot there, is that the ratios that I'm playing with started with something I knew. And so therefore, I think that we'll be okay. The one, I guess, other variable, I mean, I've talked about a lot of variables, but one other variable is of these 6 pre-mixed colors, they likely strike at slightly different rates. Some might strike to yarn faster than others. And so that could cause a bit more variation within the colors that we're gonna see over here. But I do think I should follow my gut, finish dyeing the yarn, wash it, let it dry, and then decide I want to add more color. Because when you're dealing with deep shades like this, things will feel a lot lighter once they are dry than they do now when they're wet. And so it'll be easier to feel that orange, especially because we're going for things that are so deep and muted and moody. So I'm trusting the process. And while I have your attention, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It has been 30 minutes, and so let's go ahead and remove our yarn. After 30 minutes, I went to remove the yarn from the yellow dye bath. There is definitely some yellow that you can see, those hints on the dark of the yarn. And if you look at the bare titanium, they've got a fair amount of yellow from a 0.25% depth of shade. There's a hint of color left in the pot, but most is in the yarn, so I'm gonna go ahead and let that cool completely so we can wash it. And then I did the same thing with our orange. I do in some of them see some hints of the orange color in there. In some others, it's a little harder to see. I think some of the Crazy 8 just took up more black dye overall. But again, I'm gonna reserve final judgment for once things are dry. I set the yarn aside so it could cool, so we could wash it, and then we could start dyeing some more yarn in the pan. Let's get ready to dye our red. Since our dye bath is warm, I am not going to, ooh, you can see a little bit of particles that we're gonna need to stir up. But since the dye bath is warm, I am not gonna dip this cup in. Instead, I'm gonna go to the sink and get a little bit of water to work on rinsing this out slowly. And now I do want to stir this up really, really well. I see some like globs in here, which is something that can happen with the cherry bomb color when you dissolve it. I'm gonna let this sit for about 10 minutes so we can make sure that we have all of the dye nice and dissolved before we come and add our yarn. Let's do this. Let's add all of our yarn in. I'm sort of changing the way I'm putting it in, sort of alternating the yarn that goes face down to try to make sure I'm getting good coverage. Ooh. The red is one of the colors that definitely took longer to absorb when I did this in the past. And there were some colors where there was red left over from the cool vats I attempted. And so that's actually one reason why I'm not doing cool vats for the second stages. Not only because I'm doing 6 different colors, but also just in case some of the colors won't work as well in cool vats. But I am seeing on some of it it's a little dark to say for sure, but I am seeing some good, like very subtle, deep color in a lot of this. So hopefully I have moved it enough. But now I am going to heat set this for 30 minutes and I'll stir occasionally. We're about halfway through the time with this color and it has absorbed pretty well already, but from my experience with the color, I decided that I want to add a bit more acid. So I just added 4 tablespoons of white vinegar because I want the color to set well. And this does mean that I will likely reset the dye bath for the next color. But adding more vinegar, actually that probably did help that last little bit of red soak up. But we'll finish up the 30 minutes with our color. When the 30 minutes were up, I turned off the heat, removed the yarn from the dye bath, and set it aside to cool so we could start the next color. Okay, into the same bath as the yellow, I am gonna add our green dye. And again, since this dye bath is warm, I'm not gonna put this cup in, but we will rinse it out. There we go. And I believe that this green dye was pretty well dissolved to start with, but there's no harm in waiting a little bit, stirring this occasionally before we add the yarn, just to make sure things are well mixed and dissolved. Okay, I'm gonna reduce the heat while we get ready to add our yarn. And I have my tongs ready if I need it. I'm gonna go in really, really fast at first. This green is also one of the colors that didn't absorb all the way, I believe, when I was doing these colors for Hanukkah. So this is another reason why I didn't necessarily want to try with Cool Vat, and a reason why I didn't want to go too saturated with the colors. But you can see from all of them that we do have a reasonable amount of color. But yeah, we've now got the yarn in, hopefully enough space for good coverage, and we're gonna wait 30 minutes. And again, I might come and stir occasionally just to make sure that things are well mixed. It's been 15 minutes and there's still a reasonable amount of green in here. So I'm gonna add more acid, even though that means that I'll probably reset the pot for the next color. 2, 3, 4. So now we're up to 3 tablespoons of vinegar per 8 cups of water. And we may end up doing this one more time depending on if this green stays or not, but I figured it was worth adding some more acid. The timer went off. I'm gonna put the heat on very, very low so we can check and see if we're still seeing residual green, and we are. Okay, so I think what I'm gonna do is go ahead and add some more acid and to see if this makes a difference. So now we've doubled the amount of acid that we had in here to start with. And it's possible, it's very possible that doing this will help that little bit of color absorb, or maybe that's just some residual color that isn't gonna absorb. So we will check back in 10 minutes and then remove the yarn at that point. All right, let's see where we are. Hey, it has lightened a little bit. It's a bit yellow, but a little bit less green. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and give this another 10 minutes since we did see a change, and then we'll think about the next step. Okay, I'm gonna turn off the heat and let's look and see where things are. Okay, there's still like a bit of that yellow there, but I'm gonna go ahead and remove the yarn now, and so we can set it aside to cool, especially since that yellow is not that changed. And I don't know if we'll see bleeding with this, but it will get some more heat as things start to cool, and so that's not a bad thing. But the color does look really, really nice. And so for that, I am excited. So if you can't find the zip tie, I try to grab the yarn in the middle, so that way you don't like twist or potentially tangle things more than maybe they could be. And so then I found the zip tie, and we can gently remove some water. And I'm gonna reset this pot so we can dye our last colors. I reset the steam pan with 32 cups of water, 8 tablespoons of white vinegar, and then added our dissolved 1 gram of the royal purple, I think that's the name of the color, acid dye. Once the pan finished heating up to be near a boil, I added the 400 grams of yarn, stirring it around like we had done with the previous colors. Of all the colors I've done so far, the purple appears to be the most pigmented, which had me a little nervous. However dark the purple looked before I added the yarn in, it soaked into the yarn pretty quickly, and I think worked perfectly. I should not be overthinking things. After 30 minutes, the color had completely absorbed onto the yarn, so I removed the yarn and set it aside to cool. I added 32 cups of water, 8 tablespoons of white vinegar, and our 1 gram of extreme blue acid dye to the 12-quart pot, stirred things up, heated up the pot, and then added the yarn to dye our final color. The blue is the only one of the colors that I didn't see side by side with everything else. I'm just inferring based on the way the other colors went, that the blue will hopefully fit pretty well. There was a hint of blue left in the pot when I removed the yarn after 30 minutes, so I added another 4 tablespoons of vinegar, put the yarn back in, and turn off the heat to just let the yarn cool in the pot for a bit to absorb that leftover color. After a little while, the rest of the blues absorbed to the yarn, so I removed all the yarn from the pot to let it cool so that way we could go start washing all of our colors. One at a time, I washed each of our 6 colors in some lukewarm water with a little bit of some clear dish soap. Some of the colors had a hair of bleeding, but really it was super minimal and resolved in just a handful of washes. And so I proceeded to the next colors. Although in the middle of washing, I realized I had meant to show all 6 of these colors side by side before washing, so that way we could see how it looked as a rainbow. And well, I realized that I forgot to do that after I'd already washed a couple. So we will take a look at the yarn while still damp but on the drying rack, but before it is actually dry. Here is the yarn on the drying rack, and I see a very beautiful muted rainbow here. The one color I'm a hair unsure about is the orange. I think that because gray is so cool toned and adding orange to it makes it brown, I don't know if some of these are gonna feel like an orange or if they're just gonna feel brown. So there's a chance I may wanna over dye a couple of these, but we'll have to divide them up into sets to see how it feels, because it also may just work even if it is a little brown. There's a lot of variation within each of these, within some that are a little bit lighter and some that are deeper. And once everything's dry, we're gonna take a closer look at all of it. The rainbow is really, really fun with these pops of color in there. One thing I will note is that clearly I moved where the zip ties were during the drying process, and we've got some definite lighter patches on the purple, and we'll see about the other colors as well. But as for over dyeing and whether or not that is necessary for any of the colors, the only one where I think we might need it is the orange, but it really is going to depend on how the sets look when we're looking at one base and the collection of 6 colors within that one base. So I am now going to go ahead and twist up all of these minis. I think that we may miss the ability to see some of the different variations in hues as the color and the black mix together on the yarn with it already twisted, but I can always untwist the minis, and this is the easiest way I can think of to divide the yarn into relevant sets of the same base. If we take a look at just titanium sock, you can see that we do have conceivably some dye lot variations within these bundles. Like in our reds, I see some deeper colors and lighter colors, and until I twist them up, I won't really know how much of that is within one skein or varies between them all. And same with the orange. Like this absolutely feels orange. Right here, this feels more brown. And so how the two interplay together, well, we'll see that soon. Winding is in progress, but I figured it was worth taking a moment to look at a few sets from one yarn base, and this base is titanium sock. I was unsure about the variation and how it would work, but I would say the 5 sets in this bundle, the colorways do feel very similar, and all of the orange minis had some orange to them. Maybe it's a little bit less than some of the other colors felt, but it works in with the overall set. But anyway, I'm going to go back to winding, but I felt that in a moment we'll be looking at each of the different yarn bases, or the without black with a couple yarn bases. But anyway, I just wanted to show some variation within one yarn base, or how there's not very much variation, because I have a feeling I'm going to stick to one set of each base when we look at everything shortly. And now that all of the minis are twisted and sorted into their respective bases, I need to create the sets so that way we can compare them to one another. What I will say is across the board, every single orange Miniskein that I saw did have more brown tan notes and then more orange notes. It may be less orange than, say, the greens are green or the blues are blue, but I feel like it still works. I think just the combination of the warm orange and black gives us more of this brownish hue. And so I was unsure if it worked well, and well, let's just take a closer look and see. Here we have our sets that we dyed of the main colorway for this video. And then 2 sets we dyed without the black dye, the Titanium sock and that Yak sock. And it's not surprising that adding the black dye makes the colors moodier, deeper, more saturated. But it is interesting to see at our 0.25% depth of shade, there is a lot of pigment in here. And so the colors aren't the most saturated, but they also are not pastel. If we compare the That Yak to the Titanium, the hue difference between them is more dramatic without the black dye than it is with the black dye. With the black dye, these colors are remarkably similar. And this just really shows that the difference between starting with a bare off-white yarn and a cool-toned oatmeal-y brown color has a bigger impact on brighter colors that are less saturated overall. Once you move into deeper, more saturated colors, having more color in the bare yarn base doesn't have as much of an impact on the color. Now, I would say that these are still a little bit more muted, a hair darker than the yarn that started out white. But comparing the sets, these, definitely feel like the same colorway, and these feel like there's more of a difference. I'm glad I went ahead and set the black dye before we dyed the colorful round. There is maybe the slightest hair of black transfer that I can see on the yellow. I don't necessarily feel it in the other colors, but yellow, since it is ultimately less pigmented, I guess is the way that a yellow feels, I can just notice it there. But overall, their black stayed in place where it was supposed to be very, very well. Before we go look at all of the yarn, I wanted to give the sparkle base a moment. This yarn base started with silver stellina. But for some of these colors, the stellina did take up a little bit of color. Of the 6 colors, 4 of them, the red, orange, green, and blue, all seem like the stellina took up a little bit of that rainbow color. The stellina does still appear much more silver on the yellow and on the purple, but I thought that this was just interesting. I know stellina sometimes picks up some pink, like when I've dyed with food coloring, but I haven't played with it with all of the dyes in my collection, and I'm not mad that it did this because it works with this set, but I just thought that that was interesting and wanted to share. Before we look at all of the yarn bases, we dyed 7 different yarn bases in this video. We have That Yak, Titanium, Shiela Sparkle, Platinum DK, Crazy 8, Diamond Sock, and then our Superwash MCN High Twist. I dyed all of these colorways in the same kettle. So some of the yarn that might absorb color a little bit faster did absorb more color than some others. The one that stands out the most is the Diamond Sock, our Superwash Merino and Silk blend. And I know from experience that silk does take more time to absorb colors, and so the other yarn that maybe is just Superwash Merino would absorb more color side by side. But also, sometimes silk blends need more dye to feel as pigmented as other ones. So those 2 factors in combination could result in the diamond feeling less saturated than a lot of the other blends. Otherwise, things are pretty close. I mean, I think that the Crazy 8 maybe absorbed a hair more of some of the colors than some of the other blends, even compared to the Titanium, but the difference is not that extreme. It is so much fun to take information that I learned from color mixing exercises, whether I'm mixing primaries together or playing with shades of a color by mixing in some black, and to take that information to create a set. The one note that I might change if I were to do this again is potentially to increase the amount of the orange that I was using, but it does work in these sets. It doesn't feel like it's lacking.
And especially if we look at the yarn without any black at all, the orange there does stand up very well with the other colors. I think it's just the one where adding the black to it does hide some elements of it more compared to the other colors. But these sets work, and I am beyond thrilled with them. We used 7 different acid dye colors to create these sets today, but you could create something very, very similar with as few as 3 premixed colors. If we started with black, blue, yellow, and red, or maybe black, cyan, magenta, and yellow, you could mix your secondaries and then do shades with that to create a very similar palette. So while I love and have a huge library of different premixed acid dyes, you don't need that in order to create a huge range of colors. And that's a big reason why I enjoy doing color mixing and sharing some of that in these videos, so that way you can see the versatility you can have with a small subset of colors, as long as you're willing to play around and see how they combine and think about the ratios together. You really can do a lot with them.
I am obsessed with this dark muted rainbow set, and I actually think that this is the colorway I dyed the most of for the 2022 Spring Miniskein mini-series sets. Now, every night during this series, there may be a small restock in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I do have some extra sets, and I don't know if there are any of the wrapped mystery samplers with extras available. At the time I'm filming this conclusion, a week before the series starts, there are a handful left, so it's worth checking out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop to see if any are available. Otherwise, you'll find some of these sets in the multiple skein set section in my shop. And you can find links down in the video description. If you don't need or want any more yarn, but still want to support the content here, the biggest thing you can do is subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and turn on notifications, because this will make it a lot more likely that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. If you want to go beyond that, I do have a Patreon, and we have new channel memberships where you can get badges and some fun emotes to use in chats, and maybe comments on videos after the fact. I'm not sure, because it looks like YouTube is beta testing some like live comment feeds on standard videos, and so we will explore this together and see how this turns out. But I and those baby birds right outside my window are very excited about these emotes that I commissioned, and I hope that you'll enjoy using them as well. There are still 2 main videos for the Spring Miniskein mini-series, plus a bonus dyeing video and a vlog remaining. And we're not done with some color mixing. Do you have any guesses about what's going to show up tomorrow night? Let me know down in the comments. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.